What's up, guys? Welcome to TPM. Thanks for watching. So this is the officially unofficial part 2 of yesterday's episode where we interviewed Wyatt Lassiter, one of the top ranked NRL 22 shooters in the country. Just recently got into precision rifle reloading himself, and he had a very interesting perspective, and we had some back and forth dialogue and some questions that we asked him to kind of clarify some of the things for those of you who are looking to get into precision rifle reloading. So I thought that was a really interesting interview, and I'd like to have Wyatt back on the show a little bit later to talk about some competition specific stuff. So him and I both have experience in NRL 22 stuff and the NRL PRS centerfire stuff. So he has a lot of good, very analytical and methodical perspectives about those two games that I think would be really beneficial to share with you guys and get that information out there. So for now, like I mentioned in yesterday's video, we're going to expand upon some of the stuff that Wyatt and I talked about. So we're going to go into our cartridge selection, that whole theory of whether you should build a cartridge around a rifle or a rifle around a cartridge if you have the opportunity to do so, and just some other things that are involved in component selection and whatnot before we actually get into the physical act of reloading our ammo. So guys, let's get started with this. All right, guys, so there's a lot of thought that goes into cartridge selection. So it's an important thing to do and understand, so you just don't go walk into a gun store and pick some random rifle off of a shelf in a cartridge that you're not super familiar with, or you don't go have your custom gun builder build you what Joe Bob has down the street just because you shot it and it shoots good. It's super important to have a very good understanding, and more of an understanding than that basic level. We need to have a higher level of understanding so we can make an informed decision, because these are not cheap purchases. So the rifle itself isn't cheap, the components are not cheap by any means, the reloading tools are not cheap. So doing our best to educate ourselves will help immensely in the long run, not only saving money, but getting you the performance and saving you the frustration of having to go through different iterations of changing gear out, changing cartridges and changing barrels and all these different things. So research, educate yourself, and do it right the first time. That's my first piece of advice for anyone out there who's looking to get into either precision rifle shooting and building a custom rifle or reloading itself. So the thought process that goes into selecting a cartridge. First of all, we have to figure out what we want to use the cartridge for. What's our purpose, right? So in my mind, we have two different categories. We have hunting over here, then we have target shooting. Target shooting encompasses everything from recreational shooting to competition shooting to target shooting, everything like that, other than hunting. And then we have different subsets of hunting out here. So we have our typical, let's say 500 yards and in. Then we can even divide that further into the size game that we're shooting in order to select our cartridge. So a antelope at 700 or 800 yards is going to have a better tool available for it than, let's say, an elk at 50 yards, or an elk at 2,000 yards, or an elk at 1,500. I'm being extreme in my examples, but you get the point. There's a right tool for the right job. So if we're looking for a kind of a one-size-fits-all type tool to suit many applications, that's also out there. You just have to do a little bit more research and be willing to sacrifice on one end or the other, which is not a big deal. So for the purpose of this, we're going to look specifically at competition shooting. All this stuff is the same for hunting. We're just going about a different path to arrive at our conclusion. So a couple things to consider. What's our budget? So that has a lot to do with cartridge selection, believe it or not. The budget comes into play when we're talking about reloading components. Some cartridges are just inherently cheaper or more expensive to reload for. That's something to take into consideration. It's an easy thing to research on your own. Go to one of the major reloading suppliers online and just take a peek at what the components cost for that specific cartridge. You'll take a look at brass, the bullet selection, all those things. So also with your budget is the availability of factory ammo, and I'm going to kind of lump those two together. If you want to shoot factory ammo and you're picking a cartridge solely based on the fact so you can occasionally shoot factory ammo if you have to or you want to, that might be a consideration as far as your budgeting goes. So if you pick something like, let's say, you guys know I like 300 Norma mag, so let's pick that. There is factory 300 Norma mag out there. I know it's super rare and it's hard to get, but it's very expensive. We're talking some of the prices I've seen exceed some of the 338 Lapua match prices. So, and that's just based on supply and demand. There's just not a lot of it out there these days. The brass is hard to get and all the components are hard to get. So it is what it is. But that plays a role in how we budget. So if you're looking to do that and shoot expensive factory ammo, that's a consideration. However, if that's not even an option for you, you're just going to reload, then focus on that, just the reloading component part. All right, so we got budget, we have our purpose, we have our hunting versus our target stuff. So then we have our expectations. So a lot of people out there get sucked into the internet conversations on forums where guys claim that they've killed elk out to 1,000 yards with a 22 long rifle and all these absurd claims and stuff, and they fall into that pit of false narratives, if you will. And they kind of develop unrealistic expectations when they go to build their rifle. And I've seen this plenty of times. I have guys out there who want to build an ELR rifle out of a 6.5 Creedmoor. And it's just, again, not the best tool for the job. And it's because they listen to other guys who sit there and say, I can shoot a target, a steel plate all day long at 2,000 yards with my 6.5 Creedmoor. That may very well be, but is there a better tool for doing that specific job? Absolutely there is. There's a lot better tools out there for doing that. So be realistic with what your purpose is, be realistic with what your expectations for the cartridge you choose are, and be realistic with the specifics, so the range, the terminal ballistics, and all the other things that come along with that cartridge and bullet selection that we'll get into in a minute. All right, so moving right along. All right, another thing to take into consideration is be realistic or be honest with yourself about your level of shooting and reloading experience. And that may play a part in what cartridge you ultimately choose. So for a new shooter and a new reloader, I would highly recommend someone to stick with a commercially available cartridge that's not only inexpensive or relatively inexpensive. It's 2023, so who are we kidding? Everything's expensive these days. But pick something that is relatively inexpensive and available in a number of configurations. So match ammo, hunting ammo, recreational ammo, etc. So you look at it and people hate hearing this, but the answer to that's going to be something along the lines of the 308 Winchester, your 6mm Creedmoor, your 6.5 Creedmoor, and those types of cartridges. They're economical, they're pleasant to shoot, they have great performance, and they just satisfy a wide range of purposes. You can hunt and compete with all of those cartridges that I just mentioned. So not only that, but if you're new to precision rifle reloading and shooting, it may be beneficial for you, like Wyatt mentioned in our video yesterday, to start out shooting factory ammo. That does a number of things. First of all, it gets you used to the rifle and it gets you used to the performance that you can expect. And it gives you a base mark of performance that you can either hope to achieve or exceed in reloading. So we'll get into some of the other details later, but not only that, you're seasoning your barrel, you're breaking in your rifle, you're breaking in yourself as a shooter, so your performance is going to gradually increase. You're developing fireform brass that you can later reload and do your own load development with. You're getting to know all these different components of precision rifle shooting. So super beneficial if you're just getting into this. Don't dive head first and go buy a rifle and then buy components and just start out there. Maybe go buy a case or a couple hundred rounds of factory match ammo, shoot those, collect the brass, just figure out all the little nuances of how your rifle feels with factory ammo, how the bolt lift feels, how the rifle shoots, what kind of ballistics you're seeing. Are you happy with those ballistics? Can you improve on them at all by choosing a different bullet or some sort of different combination of things? So all this information we're gathering in an analytical fashion and we're recording it, so later on we can make our more informed decisions. So good stuff. All right, now we get into one of my favorite topics, and this kind of boggles people's minds a little bit. So I like to talk about building a cartridge around a rifle or building a rifle around a cartridge. I love talking about that because as a custom gun builder, obviously, I want to build a rifle around a cartridge. I like to build guns. I build guns for a profession. So if I can build a rifle around a specific round or a specific bullet, to be even more exact, then that's where I want to be. That gives me the performance that I want. So I've obviously chosen a bullet that's going to perform or offer me a comfortable level of performance for my intended purpose, and I build a rifle around that. On the other hand, some of us just don't have the opportunity to build a custom rifle, which is fine. If you have an old rifle on the shelf that you want to reload for, that's 100% fine, but you're stuck reloading to the constraints of that rifle, meaning the chamber, the barrel length, the rifling twist, and all these other things that we can't change unless we do a massive and drastic overhaul on the rifle and rebarrel it or do something like that. So in a perfect world, what we're gonna do is we're gonna determine our purpose. We're going to determine our cartridge based on that purpose and something that offers a comfortable level of performance. And then we're going to further that by selecting a specific bullet that will offer us optimal performance for that purpose as well. So once we have those two components selected, we have our cartridge and we have our bullet, then we can build everything else around that. So the rest of the components kind of fall into place, and a lot of the components after that just are simply determined by your budget. So we have some 6mm Creedmoor components here that I can show you guys, and this is what we're going to be using for the rest of the Precision Rifle Reloading series here. So we chose Lapua brass. This is small rifle, it's small primer pocket brass, brand new fresh brass. So 6 Creedmoor. And for the bullets, I chose went with David Tubbs DTAC 115 grain bullets. These are, I've had a lot of luck with these bullets in the past and other calibers, 6 SLR, 243, and also 6 Creedmoor, and they shoot very well. They have a great ballistic coefficient and they're super consistent. So buying lot to lot of these bullets over the last couple years, they had a couple slight changes in them, but I've always found that the ballistic coefficient is pretty accurate, and David Tubb does a good job. And I think the ballistic coefficient is actually listed on there at 0.620. So for those of you who don't know, ballistic coefficient is basically how slippery the bullet is a simplistic way of how I like to put it. And that means as it travels through our environment. So the ballistic coefficient is how that bullet interacts with drag and how resistant it is to drag as it travels through the environment towards your target. So a higher BC or a higher ballistic coefficient is going to indicate that the bullet is more slippery in the environment and less affected by drag, which means it should, in theory, give you a flatter trajectory on target. So just a little side note there, and hopefully to clarify that. So moving on, after we choose we got one more component here. We have our Hodgdon H4350. And just to touch on that for a second with component selection. A lot of this stuff, like I said, is based on your budget, but there's a lot of this stuff that is based on historical data. And that's where my powder selection comes in. So Hodgdon H4350 is one of Hodgdon's extreme line of powders. This stuff is historically, and it's designed to be very temperature stable. So for me, I shoot in a wide range of weather temperatures or weather patterns or whatever you want to call it. So I could go from sub-zero in the wintertime all the way up to 110 degrees in the summertime. There's a big spread in the temperatures that I shoot in. So that's where this powder comes into play. Super temperature stable. I typically stay away from the ball powders, which for those of you who don't know, once again, ball powders are exactly what it sounds like. The powders, the granules of the powder are actually very small little balls, whereas this line of powders, it's an actual extrusion. So it's a small cylinder that's chopped up into little tiny cylinders. And for whatever reason, I haven't gotten into the science of it at all, this stuff offers much greater temperature stability than some of the spherical ball powders. So go figure. But in case you guys haven't noticed, I'm going to do my very best to define things and not use acronyms and stuff like that as we progress through this, because I don't want someone to sit there and watch our first episode and at the very end be like, he's talking about a G7 BC. I have no idea what that is. So we'll get into all the specifics of what we're talking about, and hopefully we're not going to leave anyone in the dark here. So moving forward. All right, guys, before we move on, I just had a little note here that I saw I think it's worth backing up a little bit and talking about, because it's a super important consideration when we're looking to reload for anything, hunting rifles or target rifles. So bullet selection is huge, right? So once again, just like our cartridge selection, I feel like bullet selection fits into two different categories. We have hunting bullets and we have target bullets. So our target bullets are typically, when I am talking about the traditional lead jacketed bullets, those bullets are typically made with thinner jackets with zero terminal ballistics or terminal performance in mind. And what I mean by that is the bullets were not designed to perform well on soft tissue. So terminal ballistics is the study of what happens to the bullet once it impacts its target. So for example, let's say an elk. We want to know what that bullet does once it enters soft tissue, so we get effective clean kills. So that's what terminal ballistics is. So target bullets were not made with any sort of specific terminal ballistic in mind. So on the other hand, our hunting bullets are. So they're designed differently. They have heavier jackets. A lot of times the jackets are bonded to the lead core and they perform much better. They stay intact and they have reliable and consistent expansion as they enter soft tissue. So they give us those clean kills that we're looking for when we're out hunting. That's not to say that there isn't overlap between these two categories. Just like cartridges, there absolutely is, especially when we talk about the solid copper bronze alloy lathe turned monolithic bullets. A lot of those bullets perform very well and on targets, on steel, paper, etc., as they do on flesh. So your deer, elk, medium game, whatever you're hunting. So there is some overlap there, but that is one of those things to take into consideration. And a lot of times the manufacturer does a really good job of outlining exactly what the bullet is intended to be used for. So the DTACs don't have that little admonishment on there, but certain bullets do. So Berger, I think, does that, where they put a little asterisk in the box and they say not for hunting or something along those lines. But just keep that in mind. And if you're looking for optimal performance, keep that in mind. That's all I can say, is just keep that in mind. There are target bullets that perform well on game. The 215 Berger 30 cal bullet does very well, but it's intended to be a target bullet. So you're not going to get the best performance by shooting a hunting bullet in a target situation and shooting a target bullet in a hunting situation. So be mindful of that and make your choice wisely, I would say. There's a lot of anecdotal data out there that you can access that people will give their 2 cents on what their terminal performance was with a specific bullet. And I would say take that all with a grain of salt, right? Because like I mentioned before, there's plenty of people out there who claim to shoot deer and elk with a 223 or a 22 long rifle. And yes, it may work. And yes, their experience may have been such that it was successful. But once again, is that the best tool for the job? Ask yourself that. So now we can kind of move on and get past this. We talked about our cartridge selection. We talked about our bullet selection. We talked about component selection. And just to kind of touch on component selection one more time, as far as like the brass you use, a lot of it is based on your budget. So the Lapua brass is expensive. Some will say it lasts longer than some of the other commercially available brass. I would tend to agree with that, but I've had very good luck in the past with cheap range pickup brass. I've had great luck with Winchester, the brass you buy in the big bags. I've had good luck with all of that stuff. The one caveat to all that is if you want to load for the ultimate accuracy and consistency, you might have to put a little more effort into preparing that brass. So meaning uniforming primer pockets and small steps like that. The plus side of that is you only have to do it generally one time, and after that your brass is essentially trued and you can shoot it until the brass doesn't want to be reloaded anymore. So a lot of it's budget based, a lot of it is just based on how much work you want to put into it as well. Small things like primers, I can be 100% honest with you guys and say that I've used every single primer, every single manufacturer of primers out there with great success. There are differences when you switch from manufacturers, so you wouldn't want to do all your load development and workup with Remington large rifle primers and then just for some reason switch to CCIs. The primers do have different burn rates or burn heats or whatever you want to call it, but they affect the output pressure of the cartridge when it's fired, and that's a fact. So be mindful of that when you're choosing your components. Make sure you have enough to reload the amount that you want to shoot, so you don't have to do something like a primer change, because if I did that and I was going to change primers in the middle of reloading for a rifle, I'd probably end up doing a whole load development, or at least back off my powder charge a little bit so I could see how the cartridge is going to react with the new primers. All right. All right, guys, now let's get into some very mildly technical stuff, which is kind of the stuff that I enjoy. We're going to dip our toes into ballistics a little bit and answer a couple questions and clarify a couple things for new reloaders and new shooters out there. So first off, we're going to talk about ballistic coefficient. I've learned that a lot of people, in fact, I'd say probably the majority of shooters out there, have no idea what ballistic coefficient is. The only people that do understand this are folks who have experience in long-range shooting. But even then, there's some folks who have experience in long-range shooting, but they still don't know what ballistic coefficient is. They understand how to make a trajectory card and all this stuff, but it's based on validating distances and shooting targets at different distances instead of using a ballistic app or a ballistic solver to arrive at their trajectory conclusion. All right, ballistic coefficients. In a nutshell, a ballistic coefficient is a number that represents a bullet's interaction with drag, how resistant it is to drag as it travels through the atmosphere. We typically use two different drag models for the purpose of shooting. First of all, we have the G1 drag model. These are scientific models that were developed that demonstrate how a bullet is resistant to drag through the atmosphere. So the G1 was originally designed for flat-based bullets, so our non-bowtail style bullets, like the typical flat-based 6mm bench rest, 22 bench rest, and that class of bullets. So it does offer a prediction as far as trajectory goes for the bowtail bullets, but is not as accurate as the G7. The G7 drag model, on the other hand, was developed for a bowtail style projectile. That gives us a much more accurate prediction downrange of what our bullet is going to do as far as trajectory goes. So for long range shooting, 99% of the time, I would say we use the G7 drag model to determine our trajectory. So that is not to say that the G1 doesn't offer us anything, because a lot of times, just like on this box of DTACs here, you're going to see a G1 ballistic coefficient on your box of bullets. The G1 still is used as a measuring stick, and you can still use it to make a trajectory card or predict the trajectory of your cartridge, but it's not going to be as accurate. That being said, when I'm looking at bullets, I'm very familiar with the G1 ballistic coefficient, so I know kind of the threshold of where I want to be for a specific purpose. So I can use that as a measuring stick and figure out where I want to be. However, when I go and I determine my trajectory card, I'm going to use a G7 ballistic coefficient. So all this stuff is very interesting. If you guys have any interest at all in learning more about ballistics, especially ballistic coefficients, how they're derived, the tools that they use to determine the ballistic coefficients, a little bit more on these scientific drag models, you could check out any of the literature by Brian Litz. So Brian Litz is the chief ballistician with Berger Bullets. The guy is an absolute whiz at this stuff. I've talked to him personally a couple times, and he's a great resource. There's a couple good books out there, Applied Ballistics, and he has a couple more now, and they really get into detail about this stuff that we're talking about now. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to kind of glaze over this, and we're just going to get the general definitions of ballistic coefficients out there for you guys to clarify a couple things so you know what these numbers are when you look at a box of ammo or a box of bullets and you see these G1 or G7 numbers there, what to look for. And as far as the numbers go, it's all relative to the bullet and the cartridge. So I can't sit there and say that you should look for such and such ballistic coefficient for such and such caliber, because the ballistic coefficients obviously change for every single bullet. So it's all caliber specific, it's all bullet specific, and it's one of those things you kind of have to do a little research on. And the beauty of this is once you have this information, you have your ballistic coefficient, you have an estimated velocity, you can take that information and come up with scenarios on the ballistic solvers online and figure out what your trajectory is going to look like before you even start reloading. So a bunch of good resources out there, a bunch of good tools. check them out and educate yourself, because it's good information to have. And again, it explains the why behind what we're doing here. All right, guys, so we just kind of covered a whole bunch of stuff. And where we're at right now to kind of bring things together is we have determined our purpose, we've determined a cartridge based on our purpose, we determined a bullet based on our purpose, and we have all of our components that are based on our budget and our performance objectives. So now we have our cartridge completely wrapped up. So what I like to do at this point, and when I'm building a new rifle, is I'll take that cartridge, and it doesn't have to be sitting here physically in your hand. It can be a hypothetical cartridge that you built using your pen and paper or your notepad here, but at least you have the specs for that cartridge and the bullet. Then from there, we can determine certain different attributes on our rifle, if we're having a custom rifle built, that will optimize the performance for that cartridge that we selected. So the number one thing is rifling rate of twist. That is the number one thing that's going to affect the performance for the bullet that you selected. One of the big downfalls that we see in factory rifles is the twist rates are very, very conservative. So we're not seeing the faster, more modern twist rates to stabilize the longer and heavier bullets that have the higher ballistic coefficients that we typically like to shoot in long-range shooting. So the factory rifles, especially hunting rifles, are more built along the lines of a like a Leatherman tool. It's a all-in-one thing that's supposed to shoot a variety of ammunition well. So if we're building a rifle with a specific purpose and shooting a specific round, then we can optimize our rifling rate of twist for the best performance. So how do we do that? Well, we can start with the bullet manufacturer. If we're shooting Berger bullets, Berger does a great job of listing the minimum rate of twist for the specific bullet that they're selling you. Sierra, I think, does the same thing if you go to their website. I'm pretty sure that Hornady does the same thing now. With the recent upswing in precision rifle shooting, all the major manufacturers have done a pretty good job of kind of updating their ballistic coefficients and making sure that their required twist rates and their ballistic coefficients are more accurate than they used to be in the past. So a great way to start and figure out your optimal rate of twist for your rifle. So aside from that, if we're building a rifle and we want to build a rifle for a specific condition, there's some tools out there that we can use to simulate those conditions, because one of the components that determines the stability of your bullet is the environment. So we have a couple basic components that go into a stability calculator. So one of them is environment, like I just mentioned. The other one is the specs on the bullet. So we need our bullet length, bullet weight, bullet diameter, and based on that, we can determine how stable that bullet is going to be when it's fired at such and such velocity through such and such a rifle rate of twist. So Berger has a really good stability calculator on their website. If you choose Berger bullets, then you can choose your specific bullet from the drop-down menu, and it auto-populates the information for the bullet. Then all you have to do is enter your environmental factors and your velocity and your rifling rate of twist. And what you're going to see is what's called a stability factor in the output. The stability factor just shows the level of gyroscopic stability that that bullet is experiencing when it leaves the muzzle. So I say gyroscopic stability, so the best way to describe this is throwing a nice tight spiral on a football. That is a perfect example of gyroscopic stability. The football is rotating, it maintains its nice straight flight path, it maintains its proper orientation as it goes down range, and that's where we're looking for a bullet to do. So on our stability factor output that we're going to see from one of these calculators, you're going to see a number of outputs that could range from 0 all the way up to over 2. So what we're looking for is something over a stability factor of 1.5. So that all comes into play. There's a lot of math involved in that, including the bullet RPMs and all this other stuff. But all you have to know is you're looking for a stability factor of over 1.5. Anything over 1 is theoretically going to be stable. So between 1 and 1.5 is going to be stable, but that doesn't necessarily optimize the ballistics for that bullet. And having a bullet that is that close to the edge of stability there at that 1.0 mark could cause problems if you change environments. So if you go from a very hot environment to a very cold environment, that's going to change how the environment affects, how drag affects your bullet and how the bullet is stabilized as the rifling imparts rotation on your bullet. So you want to find something that's north of the 1.5 stability factor range, and that should lend itself well to a variety of environments and shooting conditions. All right, guys, just to better illustrate what I'm talking about with the stability analysis, I went ahead and I pulled up the Berger stability calculator on the screen in front of you. So as you can see, I just picked a random bullet and entered random environmental conditions, but this is what the output looks like. So we have unstable at a stability factor of less than 1.0, and we have marginal stability from 1.0 to 1.5, like I was mentioning. And then north of 1.5, we have our comfortable stability factor. So what this means is when we're figuring out a rate of twist for our rifle barrel, we want to make sure that our rifle barrel is going to give us comfortable stability. So pick a rifling rate of twist that is suitable for the specific bullet that we chose here. So I believe David Tubb lists on the box that these have a 8 twist or faster barrel. So typically the manufacturer is going to list the minimum rate of twist. I like to shoot 7.5 twist, 6mm Creedmoor barrels, so that's what we're going to shoot. We have a 7.5 twist barrel built up on the Terminus that I built back there, and that's what we're going to shoot. And you input that information, and I'll do that in a second, but it shows that we have very, very comfortable stability. So that should offer us optimal performance, and we should have no stability issues as we change environments. All right, guys, so that was not too much technical stuff. We're going to get into a whole lot more technical stuff here as we progress, but I hope that kind of clarified a couple things. And there's a lot of information, like Wyatt and I talked about in the interview. There's a lot of information out there on the internet that's great. There's a lot of it that's really bad, and I'd say the majority of it is probably really bad information. It's your job to educate yourself, so when you see this information, you're able to discern whether or not it's good information or bad information, and then you can take that and use it to make decisions like what we just talked about. So that wraps it up for today, you guys. We're going to stop there. We have our cartridge components picked out. We have our rifling rated twist picked out and confirmed. So we used our stability calculator to confirm that our 7.5 twist 6mm barrel is going to effectively stabilize these 115 DTACs. We have our good powder picked out. So for the next episode, we're going to kind of dive into the actual process of developing our first loads. Where do we start? How do we get the information on what powder charge we start with? What kind of increments should we increase or decrease in order to do our testing? What kind of testing should we do first? A lot of these questions that people have when they're first starting out doing this stuff. So hopefully we'll be able to get those questions answered for you guys. So until next weekend, you guys, have a good one. Hope you enjoyed this stuff, and we will see you next time.